May 8th, 1945, the day Nazi Germany surrendered. But somewhere in the mountains of southwestern Poland, a train carrying billions in gold, precious art, and plundered treasure simply vanished. Now, before we go any further, you might want to grab yourself a coffee, maybe settle into your chair, because what you're about to hear, it's one of those stories that stays with you. This is the kind of mystery that's had treasure hunters, historians, and governments searching for over 70 years. So if you find this interesting, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this, they don't come around every day. Let me take you back to the spring of 1945. The Third Reich is crumbling, you understand. The Red Army is pushing from the east, the Allies from the west, and Germany knows it's over. But here's the thing. In those final desperate months, the Nazis weren't just fighting a losing war. They were moving things, hiding things, trying to salvage what they could from the ruins of their empire. And what they'd accumulated, well, it was staggering. You see, for 12 years, the Nazi regime had systematically looted Europe. Not just Germany, but Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, Austria. Every country they conquered, they stripped bare. Gold from central banks, art from museums, jewelry from homes, from people who would never see their possessions again. We're talking about paintings by Rembrandt, Da Vinci, Vermeer. We're talking about religious artifacts that had survived centuries. And we're talking about gold. Tons and tons of gold bullion melted down from wedding rings, from dental fillings, from sources we can barely bring ourselves to think about. By early 1945, much of this treasure was concentrated in what was then called Lower Silesia, a region in southwestern Poland, though at that time it was German territory, part of the province they called Niederschlesien. The city of Wrocław, or Breslau, as the Germans knew it, had become a major collection point for these stolen riches. And as the Soviet forces advanced, getting closer each day, the Nazis faced a big problem. What do you do with billions in treasure when the enemy is at your doorstep? The answer, or at least what many believe was the answer, involved the railways. You see, Lower Silesia wasn't just any region. The mountains there, the Owl Mountains, the Soe Mountains, as they're called in Polish, they were riddled with tunnels. The Nazis had been building underground facilities there since 1943, part of something called Project Riese, giant in English. These weren't small operations, mind you. These were massive tunnel complexes carved deep into the mountain rock, meant to house weapons factories, command centers, maybe even Hitler's last headquarters. Thousands of prisoners, mostly from concentration camps, they died digging those tunnels. And here's where our story really begins. In the chaos of those final weeks, as the Soviets closed in, witnesses, ordinary people living in the area, they reported seeing trains, heavily guarded trains, heading into the mountains. These weren't regular military transports, no. These trains moved at night, under extreme secrecy, with armed SS guards who didn't let anyone near. One train in particular, this is where the legend starts to take shape. Multiple witnesses described a train, an armored train, some said, that entered a tunnel near the town of Wałbrzych, formerly known as Waldenburg. The date, this is important, the date was sometime in April 1945, probably between the 20th and the 30th. The exact date, well, that's lost to history, but what matters is this. The train went in, and according to these witnesses, it never came out. Now, you might be thinking, trains don't just disappear, right? There's got to be a logical explanation. And you'd be right to think that. You'd be absolutely right. But here's the thing. When the Soviets took control of the region in May 1945, they sealed many of these tunnels. They filled some with concrete, they flooded others, they made them inaccessible. Why? Well, that's one of the questions that's fueled this mystery for decades. Some say the Soviets found the train themselves and quietly removed its contents back to Moscow. Others believe the Germans, in those final desperate hours, they collapsed the tunnel deliberately, sealing the train inside as a kind of time capsule, or maybe they thought they'd come back for it someday. And some think the whole thing is a myth, a story that grew from rumors and wishful thinking. But let's look at what we know, what we can actually verify. The Nazi gold train, as it's come to be called, it's not just based on witness testimony from frightened civilians in a war zone. There are documents, bits and pieces of evidence that suggest something significant happened in those mountains. In the archives, researchers have found references to train movements in Lower Silesia during April 1945. There are mentions of special cargo and classified materials being transported toward the mountain region. There are deployment orders for SS units to guard certain railway sections. And there are reports, German military reports from that period, that talk about securing valuable assets from advancing Soviet forces. Then there's the testimony of a German soldier, a man named, his name has been given as either Jakob or Heinrich in different accounts, but what matters is what he said. On his deathbed in the 1950s, he reportedly told his family about a train he'd helped load in Breslau. He described gold bars, so heavy they needed 2 men to lift them. He described crates of jewelry, paintings wrapped in cloth, religious items. And he said they loaded all of this onto a train that was heading southwest, into the mountains. He claimed the train was going to be hidden in a tunnel, and that the entrance would be sealed. He drew a rough map, they say, trying to show where this tunnel was located. This deathbed confession, it circulated for years, mostly as a family story, but in the decades that followed, more and more people started coming forward with similar accounts. A railway worker who remembered seeing a train being directed into a side tunnel. A local resident who recalled hearing explosions in the mountains shortly after that train supposedly entered. A Polish resistance fighter who claimed his unit had observed German engineering teams working near a tunnel entrance doing something with explosives. Now, are all these stories true? Are they accurate? That's the difficulty with this kind of historical investigation. Memories fade, details get confused, people sometimes they remember what they want to remember, or what makes a good story. But when you have multiple independent sources describing similar events, that's when historians start paying attention. The Polish government certainly paid attention. In the decades after the war, they conducted several searches in the Owl Mountains. In the 1950s and 60s, they brought in mining experts and military personnel to explore some of those sealed tunnels. They used whatever technology was available at the time, which, you have to understand, it wasn't much by today's standards. Ground-penetrating radar? That didn't exist yet. They had to rely on old maps, on physical exploration, on basically poking around and hoping to find something. And here's the thing. They did find things. Not the gold train, but they found evidence of Nazi activity in those tunnels that nobody had known about. They found abandoned equipment. They found personal belongings. They found the remains of prisoners who died digging those tunnels. What they didn't find, or at least what they didn't publicly acknowledge finding, was a train full of treasure. The mystery might have faded into obscurity, becoming just another piece of World War II folklore, except in 2015, something happened that brought the Nazi gold train back into the headlines around the world. 2 men, a Pole named Piotr Koper and a German named Andreas Richter, they came forward with a rather extraordinary claim. They said they'd found it, the train. Using ground-penetrating radar, they detected what appeared to be a large metal object, roughly the size and shape of a train, buried underground near the town of Walbrecht. The location, according to their radar scans, was at a depth of about 8 to 9 meters, beneath what had once been a railway embankment. Now, you can imagine the reaction this caused. Suddenly, the gold train wasn't just a legend, it was potentially real. The Polish media went crazy with the story. International news outlets picked it up. Treasure hunters from around the world started booking flights to Poland. The local government in Wałbrzych, they found themselves in a very unusual situation. They had to take this claim seriously, but they also had to manage public expectations, and frankly, they had to deal with a sudden surge of people showing up with metal detectors and shovels. Koper and Richter, these two men, they were very confident. They held press conferences, they showed their radar images, they described what they believed was down there. According to their scans, the object was approximately 100 to 120 meters long, consistent with a German military train from that era. The signatures they were getting suggested metal, lots of metal, and possibly void spaces inside, which would be consistent with train cars. The Polish government, to their credit, they handled this carefully. They brought in their own experts, geologists, military engineers, historians. They commissioned independent ground-penetrating radar surveys. They wanted to know, before they started any excavation, whether there was really something down there worth digging for. And they had to consider another factor, a dangerous factor. You see, if this train existed, if it had been sealed in a tunnel in 1945, there was a real possibility it was booby-trapped. The Nazis were known for that kind of thing, especially toward the end of the war. They'd leave explosives, they'd set up delayed fuses, they'd create cave-in traps. The thought of accidentally triggering something that had been sitting there for 70 years, well, that required careful planning. The excavation, when it finally began in August 2016, it was a major operation. They had to clear the area, they had to bring in heavy equipment, they had to have bomb disposal experts on standby. Media from around the world showed up to watch. It was, for a brief moment, one of the biggest archaeological stories on the planet. And then they started digging. Meter after meter, they went down through the earth, following the radar signatures. They found the old railway embankment, just where the map said it would be. They found remnants of track, bits of railway infrastructure. They kept going, kept excavating, getting closer to where the scans had indicated this large metal object should be. But when they reached the depth where the train should have been, there was nothing. No train, no tunnel, no treasure. Just earth and rock, and the disappointed faces of investigators who had been hoping to solve one of World War II's greatest mysteries. So, what happened? Why did the radar show something that wasn't there? The official explanation, the one the Polish geological team gave, was that the radar signatures had probably been picking up natural rock formations, possibly combined with old reinforced concrete structures from the Nazi-era tunnel construction. Ground-penetrating radar, you see, it's not perfect. It can be fooled by certain geological conditions. Dense rock, groundwater, metal ore deposits, these things can create signatures that look like man-made objects. Koper and Richter, the two men who made the claim, they didn't accept this explanation. They insisted their equipment was accurate. They insisted there was something there, even if the excavation hadn't found it. They suggested perhaps they dug in the wrong spot, or perhaps the authorities hadn't dug deep enough. They maintained their belief that the train exists somewhere in those mountains. And that's where things stood after 2016. The big excavation had come up empty, and many people, including many historians and experts, they concluded that the Nazi gold train was exactly what skeptics had always said it was, a myth, a legend with no basis in fact. But, and this is important, the 2016 excavation, it didn't disprove the train's existence. It just failed to find it in one specific location. The Owl Mountains, they're vast, full of tunnels, many of which remain unexplored or are too dangerous to enter. The Nazi Project Riese, remember, it was never completed. We don't have accurate maps of all the tunnels that were dug. Some have collapsed, some are flooded, some are sealed and forgotten. And there's another aspect to this story that's worth considering. Let's say, just for argument's sake, that there was no gold train. Let's say it's entirely a myth. Even if that's true, what isn't a myth is the Nazi looting operation itself. That absolutely happened. And the scale of it, it's almost incomprehensible. The Nazis stole an estimated 600,000 works of art during World War II. They looted approximately 100,000 tons of gold, silver, and precious metals from occupied territories. They plundered cultural treasures, religious artifacts, entire museum collections. And here's the crucial thing. A significant portion of this stolen property has never been recovered. After the war, the Allies established what they called the Monuments Men, a special unit dedicated to tracking down and recovering stolen art and cultural treasures. They did incredible work. They really did. They found Nazi hoards hidden in salt mines, in castles, in bank vaults. They recovered thousands of pieces and tried to return them to their rightful owners or countries. But they didn't get everything. Far from it. Even today, museums and private collections around the world, they're still discovering that some of their pieces are Nazi loot. Families are still fighting legal battles to recover artworks that were stolen from their grandparents. And experts estimate that there is still billions of dollars worth of treasure out there, somewhere, waiting to be found. So whether or not there's a specific train buried in the Polish mountains, the broader story, the story of missing Nazi treasure, that's absolutely real. And Poland, given its history during the war, given the Nazi presence there, given the tunnel systems they built, Poland is exactly the kind of place where you might find something. Let's talk about what was in Poland during those final months. Wrocław, or Breslau, it was one of the last major German cities to fall to the Soviets. The siege of Breslau lasted from February to May 1945, one of the longest and most brutal urban battles of the war. During that siege, the city was cut off, surrounded, but for a while there were still railway connections to the south and west, into those mountains. The Nazis used that time, those precious few weeks, to evacuate what they could. We know this from surviving records. There are manifests, incomplete and fragmentary, but they exist, showing shipments of cultural items and financial assets leaving Breslau in late March and early April 1945. Where did these shipments go? The documents don't always say, but the directions indicated southwest, toward the mountain region. There's also the matter of what was stored in the various castles and estates around Wrocław. The Nazis had requisitioned hundreds of properties to use as storage for their stolen treasures. Schansch Castle, just outside Wałbrzych, that was a major Nazi facility. Hitler himself had visited it, and there were plans, serious plans, to convert it into one of his residences. The castle had extensive underground spaces, and the Nazis expanded these, digging deeper, connecting them to the tunnel systems in the mountains. When the Soviets arrived, they found Schansch Castle largely empty. The Nazis had removed most of what was stored there. But removed it to where? That's the question that's never been satisfactorily answered. Some of it, certainly, was taken west into Germany. Some was probably scattered, hidden in multiple locations. But the sheer volume of material that disappeared, it strains credibility to think it all just vanished without a trace. And then there are the personal accounts, the stories that don't make it into official histories, but get passed down through families. A woman who was a child in 1945 remembered her father, a railway official, coming home one night and telling her mother in hushed tones about a special train he'd been ordered to help prepare. He'd described it as the most heavily guarded train he'd ever seen, and he'd said something that stuck with her. He said the train was going to sleep. Those were his words, going to sleep in the mountain. A former German officer, interviewed in the 1970s for a documentary that was never completed, he mentioned train operations in the final days. He said there was a lot of confusion, a lot of contradictory orders, but he distinctly remembered discussions about hiding material in the tunnel systems. He said the word they used was preservation. They were preserving assets for what? For a future that never came, presumably? For a Fourth Reich that would rise from the ashes? It sounds absurd now, but in those final days, in that atmosphere of desperation and delusion, who knows what they were thinking? The testimony that perhaps carries the most weight comes from a man named Teresz Slowakowski, a Polish underground resistance member who worked with British intelligence during the war. After the war, he wrote about his activities, and in his memoirs, he briefly mentioned reports his network had received in April 1945 about German train movements in Lower Silesia. He described intelligence that suggested something valuable was being hidden in the mountains, and he noted that his network had passed this information to Soviet liaison officers. What the Soviets did with that information, well, that's another question entirely. Because here's a possibility that doesn't get discussed as much as it should. What if the Soviets did find something? The Soviet occupation of Lower Silesia, it was immediate and it was total. They controlled the region for months before it was officially transferred to Polish administration. During that time, they had exclusive access to the tunnel systems, to the castles, to everything. The Soviet Union wasn't exactly transparent about their activities, especially when it came to, shall we say, liberation of German assets. We know, from documents that emerged after the fall of the Soviet Union, that they removed enormous quantities of treasure from Germany. They stripped factories, they took art collections, they hauled away entire museums. It was considered war reparations, payback for the destruction Germany had inflicted on the Soviet Union. If they found a train full of gold and art in a Polish mountain, would they have announced it? Or would they have quietly loaded it onto their own trains and sent it east? There's a tantalizing detail in the Soviet archives discovered by a Russian historian in the 1990s. It's a brief report dated June 1945 from an NKVD unit stationed in Lower Silesia. The report mentions the exploration of underground facilities and the discovery of abandoned German materials of value. The report is heavily redacted, entire sections are blacked out, but what remains suggests they found something, removed something, and classified the entire operation. What exactly they found, where they found it, those details are lost behind those black lines of redaction. Now, we have to be careful not to see conspiracies where there might just be routine wartime bureaucracy, but it's hard not to wonder. The Soviets were obsessive about secrecy, especially about anything that might reveal the extent of their acquisitions from Germany. And if they did find a Nazi treasure train, well, from their perspective, it would have been perfectly justified war reparations. But let's return to the present day, to the ongoing search. Because despite the failed excavation in 2016, people haven't given up. The legend persists, and every few years, someone comes forward with a new claim, a new theory, a new possible location. In 2017, a group of researchers announced they found evidence of a sealed tunnel near Glushice, another town in the Owl Mountains. They'd been using different technology, a combination of ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic sensors, and they claimed to have detected a void space, a cavity underground that didn't match any known tunnel on the maps. They suggested this could be where the train was hidden. As of now, no excavation has been conducted at that site, mainly because getting permits and funding for these operations, it's incredibly difficult after the disappointment of 2016. In 2019, another team said they'd identified a collapsed tunnel entrance near Walbrook that matched descriptions from witness accounts. They wanted to clear the collapse and explore what was beyond. The local authorities were understandably skeptical. They'd heard these claims before. And that's the problem with the Nazi gold train mystery. There have been so many claims, so many supposed discoveries, that it's become difficult to separate genuine leads from wishful thinking, or, frankly, from people seeking attention or funding for treasure hunting expeditions. But here's what keeps the story alive, what prevents it from being dismissed entirely. Every now and then, Something genuine is discovered. In 2020, workers renovating a building in Wrocław, they found a hidden cache behind a wall. It wasn't a train full of treasure, but it was a collection of Nazi-era documents and some pieces of jewelry that had clearly been looted. These items had been sitting there, forgotten, for 75 years. In 2021, divers exploring a flooded section of the Project Riese tunnels, they found personal items belonging to prisoners who'd worked there, and they also found sealed chambers that nobody had accessed since the war. What was in those chambers? Mostly abandoned construction equipment, but it proved that there are still unexplored areas in those mountains. And that's the thing about Lower Silesia, about those Owl Mountains. They're still giving up their secrets, slowly, gradually. Every few years, something emerges that reminds us just how much history is still buried there, waiting. So, where does that leave us? What are we to make of the Nazi gold train? Is it real, or is it a myth? The honest answer is, we don't know. There's enough evidence to keep the possibility alive, but not enough to prove anything definitively. It exists in that strange space between legend and potential reality. What we can say with certainty is this: the Nazis did loot enormous amounts of treasure. They did move this treasure around in the final months of the war. They did have access to extensive tunnel systems in Lower Silesia. They did, according to multiple witnesses, send trains into those mountains under heavy guard. And large amounts of treasure that was known to be in that region, it disappeared. Whether it's all on one train, sealed in one tunnel, that's the romantic version of the story, and it might not be accurate. The reality might be more mundane. The treasure could have been divided, hidden in multiple locations, some found, some still waiting, some lost forever to collapsed tunnels or Soviet confiscation. But the search continues. The Polish government maintains maps of all known tunnel systems. Amateur researchers pore over wartime documents looking for clues. Technology improves, making it possible to explore areas that were once inaccessible. And every person who becomes fascinated with this story, they're keeping alive the memory of what was lost, what was stolen, and what, perhaps, might still be found. There's something deeply human about treasure stories, isn't there? They appeal to something in us, that hope that there's still something out there, waiting to be discovered, some mystery not yet solved. The Nazi gold train captures our imagination not just because of the potential value of what might be aboard, but because it represents unfinished business, a piece of history that hasn't revealed all its secrets yet. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere in those Polish mountains, sealed behind rock and earth and time, there really is a train waiting in the darkness. So if this story got you thinking, if it pulled you in, there's another mystery from World War II I covered that I think you'd find just as compelling. Just click the up there, and I'll see you there.